What's up, everybody? Thank you for tuning in to the Tomatolito Show once again. And there has been a little bit of a layoff on behalf of the show. No worries. We've been working behind the scenes and some cool stuff awaiting the Tomatolito Show in the coming weeks and the coming months. Nonetheless, because of that, it has removed us from putting out episodes and kept me from having a chance to record. With that said, today's episode, I want to focus and I want to talk about the amazing start that the UFC has managed to put together to kick off 2021. It's been an awesome, action-packed weekend in and weekend out that the UFC and Dana White and the UFC have managed to put together. Some really good cards, really awesome events to date, and let's take it all the way back. What seems in your mind, it may seem like it's all the way back to the first event that they launched in 2021, which was January 16th. But as we sit here today recording this, we're just about a month, maybe just a little bit over a month removed from when that first event took place and when they kicked off their 2021 calendar. So it wasn't that long ago, just a matter of 4 weeks ago, give or take. Nonetheless, it seems like it's been so long ago already, and like that, those results have been forgotten about already because of the amount of fights and content that the UFC has been putting out and providing us with. Let's take it back. January 16th. Saturday, January 16th was the main event between, it was headlined by none other than Blessed himself, Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar. The co-main event there was going to be Carlos Condit versus Matt Brown. And that was the long-awaited matchup that it took years for that fight to finally come to fruition, and it did finally happen, and it did not disappoint. One of the special things about January 16th and what the UFC did to kick off their 2021 run was that they ended up broadcasting this event on network television, something that was very common in years past and decades past by boxing. You would have these main event cards, these main events put together on ABC and broadcasted on ABC television as far as stateside is concerned, and you would have some of the biggest draws, the biggest names, and then it basically fizzled out. Ratings started going down, whatever it was. Contract money usually is the issue, right, as it gets involved, and ends up causing a lot of stuff to go away. Just like we lost Friday night fights, Tuesday night fights on USA Boxing and what have you, whatever, right? So the UFC did something special, right? It was paid homage to the fights of yesteryear, the main events on prime time on a Saturday, and especially bringing it back, making it free to the masses, and definitely reaching a broader audience by way of ABC network, one of the largest moguls, right? Let's look at that event. It was a stacked card from top to bottom. You had up-and-coming talent, you had debuting talent, you had some top contenders fighting in that card, and a great supporting card to what ended up being a completely spectacular main event between Max Holloway and Calvin Kattar. And I guess some people would argue that it was a one-sided fight. We'll dig into that right now. Let's look at the card. Some of the notable fights that took place that night on the prelims. Let's see. Joaquin Buckley was not on the prelims. Joaquin Buckley ended up fighting on the main event. So that's the one that pops in my head as far as Joaquin Buckley, right? The attention that Joaquin Buckley had behind him after that video game style ending that he had, that spinning kick that landed on the head and ended up putting his opponent out. He ended up going viral with that clip. It was a video game style knockout by way of a kick. And it was just, I mean, you had memes, you had the Mortal Kombat Mortal Kombat memes that came out with that kick, and some Street Fighter type memes that I saw out there. And it was just something crazy, right? That it hadn't been done before. And he definitely put himself on the map. Now, he was on there. He ended up fighting Alessio Di Chirico. He wasn't able to put together the type of ending that he would have liked. And nonetheless, it was spectacular the way that fight ended. It was definitely, it definitely caught your eye the way the fight ended, but it did not go Joaquin Buckley's way this time. It was not the video game style ending that he was looking for, as he's the one that got put away this time. And Alessio Di Chirico ended up connecting a leg kick to Joaquin Buckley's head and puts him out of commission. And that took place in the first round, around the 2-minute mark of the first round. Joaquin Buckley loses this one. Another highlight reel, but this one's not in his favor. This is a bad knockout loss that he got, and a good knockout win to Di Chirico, who just looked massive compared to Joaquin Buckley. He was bigger, he was muscular, he outsized and outweighed Joaquin Buckley, it looked like, by the time that they both stepped into the octagon. Another fight that was notable on that undercard was Santiago Ponzinibbio. He was away. He was a force to be reckoned with in years past, and then he ended up falling ill. He ended up having several injuries. He fell ill. He had surgeries. In the last few years, it just took him out. Although he was still involved doing commentary for the Spanish version of the UFC, so he was not completely removed from the game, but he just wasn't in the octagon. He wasn't active by way of injury, by way of illness, you name it. It was just one after the other, that one issue after another that continued to plague Ponzinibbio's career. It was exciting to see him back. I was excited to see him back in the octagon. He faced Li Jingliang, and he started looking good. Definitely looked rusty. Started coming into his own, and boom, the heavy hands on Li Jingliang landed, put Ponzinibbio away. Not the return that he was hoping for. That fight ended fairly quickly. Also in the first round, as Ponzinibbio gets put away, Jingliang looked impressive. And he continues to move up in that welterweight division, continues to leave his mark, and he's doing so in impressive fashion. We move up to the co-main event, which was a fight that I just briefly mentioned at the beginning of this of the show. Carlos Condit, Matt Brown, the long-awaited fight between these two legendary, I guess you could say, legendary fighters. They've been around for years now. And they've seen each other in different organizations. They've run across each other throughout several points throughout their career. Fights that were supposed to happen, I believe, multiple times, and they ended up falling through for one reason or another, whether it was injury or whatever happened. It just, their careers ended up almost being at a parallel, and it almost seemed like at one point their careers should have come to a clash there, that they should have faced each other, and for one reason or another, it would always fall apart. It finally happened. Years in the making, years in waiting, and it finally happened, and the fight did not disappoint. Matt Brown was very vocal after the fight. He ends up losing this fight by way of decision. It goes all 3 rounds. He was very vocal and expressed clearly how disappointed he was with the result. He felt like he did enough to win this fight. And I think he definitely would have taken this if the fight would have stayed on the ground for the most part. However, Carlos Condit ended up doing enough to outstrike, outland, and outwork Matt Brown as far as the stand-up game is concerned. As far as the ground game, Matt Brown did control the majority of the fight when it was on the ground, but Carlos Condit was no dummy on the ground. I mean, he defended himself very well. He was able to take control, position control several times as they were on the ground as well. Combining that with the volume of strikes that he was able to land on Matt Brown, and that got him the decision. I think it was the right decision, in my opinion. Matt Brown obviously felt otherwise, and if these two were to do it again, why not? It was an entertaining fight. It was worth the wait. It only leaves to your imagination of what could have been if this fight would have happened maybe a couple years ago, maybe 4 years ago, maybe even longer than that, maybe 5 years ago when Carlos Condit was at his top peak and Matt Brown was just running through opposition. What could have been, right? Nonetheless, at this stage in their careers, in this latter part of their careers, they still perform and they leave it all out there. I would not oppose a rematch between these two legendary fighters, or his storied fighters, I should say, storied fighters. Carlos Condit walks away with the win, and that ended up setting up the main event in which I ended up putting together a preview episode of this fight for the Blessed Express as he was running into the up-and-coming prospect and contender, Calvin Kattar. Strong boxing. Wow, I mean, you could not give enough compliments to Calvin Kattar and the ascension that he has experienced, the presence that he has created in his arrival to the UFC, and how impressive he looks fight in and fight out. This was it. This was the biggest fight of his career. This was the biggest test for him. And as I covered, if you want to check out that preview episode that I put together a while back, Calvin Kattar could not lose in this fight. Even though he did lose the fight, he could not lose. Essentially, it was a win-win situation for him. This was the biggest name that he faced to date. It was the best opposition that he faced to date. If he won, his stock would skyrocket. If he lost, guess what? I just mentioned the reasons, right? This was the best opposition, the biggest name, biggest draw that he was facing. Get back on your horse, keep on going forward. So check out that preview episode as I got more into detail with that. But to me, Calvin Kattar could not lose and did not lose. Even though he lost the decision, he gained a lot of eyeballs. He attracted a lot of eyeballs. He has a whole new fan base because of his performance that night. And was Max Holloway deserving? Absolutely. This is what he needed. The Blessed Express arrived to Yas Island and left a sensation, a feeling of resurgence in the air of, if somebody starts doubting you, this is how you want to perform to revive your career and revives people's hopes in you. Change people's opinions, shift momentum back to your favor. People are already discarding them. And as I mentioned on that preview show as well, as far as Max Holloway, if he would have looked bad or he would have looked subpar or he got stopped, the conversations were going to start heading us in the direction of maybe he should hang him up. He's had weight cut issues where he's been drained. In the past, he has multiple issues that he's had in the past. He's coming off back-to-back losses. The conversations were going to be headed in a negative fashion if he would have looked anything unlike the performance that he put on. He put on a spectacular show, and this is not to paint it lightly. He broke records that night, and we're going to cover those. The performance that Max Holloway put on, his stamina just completely caught Calvin Kattar off guard. He ran right across that octagon, not letting Calvin Kattar settle in and start to execute his game plan. Holloway did not give him a chance, to catch his breath, just went forward, started boxing, beautiful boxing performance, started putting hands on his face and started cutting up Calvin Kattar early. He ended up bruising him up to the nose, ended up cutting him on the bridge of the nose. He just took control from beginning to end. The momentum never shifted, and it was just more and more and more output on behalf of Max Holloway. It just wouldn't stop. The onslaught would not stop, and it was just impressive to see. You just couldn't look away. Calvin Kattar tried. He never got to fully gain his composure and fully feel like he was part of the fight, as he was constantly on the defensive, constantly backpedaling. And when he would go forward, he was limited in his attack, as he didn't know how to properly attack Max Holloway, because it was just punches and bunches that were awaiting him to return. He threw one, Max would come back with 2 or 3 and a kick, and he just didn't let him, including Max Holloway at several points in the fight, a couple points that pop in mind. He almost discarded and dispatched Calvin Kattar, and that's where Calvin Kattar, in my opinion, won. That's where he won the most fans. The fact that he was almost put away, and anybody else Max Holloway would have put away. He almost put him away in a couple spots during the fight, and he didn't. The heart, the will, the determination that Calvin Kattar showed, the composure that he showed to be able to stick it out and gather himself and continue fighting. at least continue doing his part to try and get back in the fight at some point, even though it just wasn't working. Regardless of what he was trying that night, Max Holloway was just better. He was on a mission that night, and Calvin Kattar just got outmatched and outfought. Max Holloway, this is a performance that he put on, and let's look at the records that he set. In this fight alone, he shattered the following UFC records. Significant strikes landed. He ended up landing 445 significant strikes. The previous record was at 290. Significant strike attempts. He ended up with 744 attempts. The previous record was 515. Distance strikes landed. Strikes that he landed from a slight distance, 439. The previous record was set at 281. Significant head strikes, 274. The previous was 244. Shattered it by 30. Significant body strikes that he landed, 117. The previous was 92. Total strikes landed, 447. The previous was at 361. Total strikes attempted, 746 overall. The previous was set at 541. The mark that he ended up shattering, the 445 significant strikes landed, he held the previous record, and he had set that 290 mark when he fought Ortega, when he defeated Brian Ortega. So he was in a zone of his own. He showed up, he was zoned in, he performed like no other, and this is exactly what he needed in his career. And this type of win is going to get him right back into a title shot and across the octagon from whoever the champ ends up being between Volkanovski and Brian Ortega, as that seems to be the match that's slated for the division, and whether he gets a third match with Volkanovski or he gets Brian Ortega in a rematch, which Brian Ortega beating Volkanovski would set up a good story and a rematch in the sense in which Ortega would walk in with the title this time and Max Holloway as the challenger. Listen, the storylines are there, right? And he's hunting for his title. He wants to get his title back. And this is arguably the greatest featherweight of all time that we're witnessing right now. The argument is really strong at the moment. Some people already hail him and have him as the greatest featherweight of all time, especially after he dispatched Jose Aldo twice. But he's still active. So you can't call him the GOAT of the featherweights just yet, because he's still active and he's still doing work. But he's definitely cementing that strong argument in people's heads, planting that seed in people's heads, and making it hard to argue against. That alone was what kicked off 2021 for the UFC. That event alone. January 16th. What an event that was to kick off the 2021 calendar for the UFC. We move on. A few days later, we go on Wednesday morning, Michael Chiesa, Neil Magny. This was supposed to be Leon Edwards, Khamzat Chimaev. Again, that fight fell through once again. That was the second or third time that the fight falls through. Khamzat Chimaev continued to suffer some sickness related to the COVID-19 virus. And that fight ends up falling through. Michael Chiesa, Neil Magny moves up to the main event. And as you're experiencing this fight, this was early. In the stateside, this aired fairly early on ESPN. At the same time, to give you an idea, for those of you around the world, for the people in the country, some people were experiencing this big show that was put together that Wednesday morning. That was January 20th. There was a big concert going on. Bruce Springsteen, J-Lo, Lady Gaga, to name a few. Some big star-studded event that was taking place. And somewhere in the middle of that big event, they happened to inaugurate the current president for the United States, Joseph Biden, the newly appointed president. it was a big show, right? And across the pond, you got the UFC on a stack card with up-and-coming talent, headlined by Michael Chiesa and Neil Magny. The card started airing stateside at 10 in the morning, and they're putting on their own event, not taking the bench for anybody. Dana White just unapologetic about it. He just went through with it, and he's like, hey, people will watch if they want to, and if they don't, oh well. But the fights are going on, and this is the second event that he put on in a matter of days. Michael Chiesa looked every bit impressive against Neil Magny. We know Neil Magny. Neil Magny of past is a heavy volume, a high volume striking, perfectionist, I guess you could say. He mixes, and the way that he combines his punches and kicks, the way that he has a high volume output as far as strikes are concerned, is what's given trouble to every single one of his previous opponents. And you're expecting this to be Neil Magny's attack again and game plan. Michael Chiesa ended up doing away with that plan. Michael Chiesa dragged Neil Magny into his game plan. He executed it perfectly, and by that, Magny never really got to work his game plan. He ended up getting sucked into Michael Chiesa's strategy, and the fight ended up on the ground more than Neil Magny would have liked. Great performance by Michael Chiesa, impressive at that, in which we see another notch in his game. He ended up improving tenfold. He improves on his stand-up. He improves on his ground game. He was taking Neil Magny down at will and performing awesome ground and pound on Neil Magny. And you see Michael Chiesa once again improve and show a different side of his repertoire. He continues to grow as a fighter. He continues to get better. And it was a pretty dominant performance by Michael Chiesa. To his credit, this fight, it was almost as if before the fight happened and leading to the fight, people were saying that this was going to be a tough test for him because of what people are used to seeing and fans are used to seeing from Neil Magny and the experts. He eliminated that. He neutralized Neil Magny's attack, didn't even let him settle into himself, similar to what we saw a few days prior with Holloway and Cater. Michael Chiesa just stuck to his game plan. He was too strong for Neil Magny. He was fast. He looked good, and he did what he wanted that day. He was just possessed, and he looked good, and he continues to get better. At the end of the fight, he ends up calling out none other than Colby Covington, the outspoken Colby Covington. He calls him out. Who knows if that fight's gonna happen or not? Now that we're playing recap, we'll bring this up again later on in this episode and revisit how it may actually make sense that this fight happens, because Colby Covington ended up playing himself out, basically, of a match. Michael Chiesa, impressive victory. This is a few days just after the Holloway Cater fight, and then we move on to immediately post-event, and then the next day on Thursday, all the attention shifts over to UFC 257, which was going to be headlined by the return of Conor McGregor and the long-awaited rematch between him and the Diamond, Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is not even the slightest version of the fighter that Conor McGregor faced 6 years prior. He has come tenfold, hundredfold, you name it. He's a completely different fighter. He's a complete fighter. He mixes his stand-up very well. He puts combinations very well. His boxing is super impressive. His kicking is impressive. His ground game is impressive. And of course, it took him all the way to a big matchup against Khabib, in which he came up short. He was able to secure that interim title, but he came up short against Khabib when he tried to unify. After that, last year we saw him in what was arguably the fight of the year, right, against Dan Hooker. Now we see him in this big rematch and this big stack card against Conor McGregor. And then the co-main event was also another fight that was going to help figure out this craziness that's going on in the lightweight standings. And it was going to be the debut of Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier's prior opponent, Dan Hooker, who accepted the challenge and was willing to welcome Chandler to the UFC. That was what people wanted to see. That was a curiosity behind that debut, right? Can Michael Chandler cut it in the UFC? A lot of people, a lot of experts, a lot of fans, a lot of casuals, even a lot of hardcore fans just overlook the talent that comes from Bellator. This was the big signing, and it was almost as if people wanted to see Michael Chandler lose, and people had ill will towards Michael Chandler because he gets signed late last year. He gets signed. It's a big acquisition by the UFC. Michael Chandler makes a decision to leave the only home that he's known to date, and he has a stacked resume. He has a resume that's comparable to those names like Eddie Alvarez, to Dustin Poirier himself. Just a storied resume that he has. He finally decides to leave Bellator, which is the only professional home that he's known to date. He leaves, he goes to the UFC, wants to make the leap. And when they signed him, they put him in line as the fill-in in case Justin Gaethje or Khabib failed to make weight, or one of the fighters ended up falling out. Michael Chandler was going to be input into that title fight. Luckily, both fighters made weight. Both fighters went on to fight. Khabib ends up coming away with that stoppage over Justin Gaethje. Michael Chandler was not used. And then we started hearing the talks that Chandler was going to fight Tony Ferguson. That didn't happen. Tony Ferguson ended up going against Charles Oliveira in December, and Michael Chandler was left without a dance partner again. And then he finally gets the confirmation that Dan Hooker was going to be ready. After that tough fight that he had with Dustin Poirier the previous summer, he was going to be ready in time to enter the call and welcome Michael Chandler to the UFC. The fight, when they step into the octagon and the fight was going to start, Michael Chandler looked like he was a child. He looked like he was 5 foot tall, and Dan Hooker looked like he was 7 foot tall. It looked like Derek Fisher versus Shaquille O'Neal. Like, it was a huge mismatch in height. Michael Chandler looked short, looked stocky, looked in great shape. Hooker looked like he was just going to have a hell of a time with Michael Chandler, just have his way with Michael Chandler by way of reach, just keep him at bay, kick him. But the speed of Michael Chandler was the difference there. So we jump into this weekend, that co-main event, as I'm jumping into this fight already, and I'll digress. The speed that Michael Chandler showed in that fight was second to none. He was just bobbing and weaving and moving in and out, and Dan Hooker never had a chance to really gauge him properly. And Michael Chandler landed that big punch, drops Dan Hooker, and he closes in, drops to his knees near Dan Hooker's head, and it seemed like he rabbit punched him in such a speedy succession. Must have landed about 8 to 10 punches in quick succession until the referee steps in and waves the fight off. But it was a one powerful punch and then just hammer. Not even hammer fist. It was just like a drilling of punches that he got to Dan Hooker's head, and until the referee waved the fight off. That ended up moving Michael Chandler immediately up in the rankings. Dan Hooker ends up dropping a little bit. And it ends up figuring out the crazy situation going on at the lightweight division. That's that. Let me move back a little bit. I start getting excited and I start moving straight into these fights. But let me move back, because now we're going to talk about the main event. That co-main event did not disappoint. We move back into the main event, and something that I wanted to touch on. We leave the Michael Chiesa event on Wednesday. Thursday, the press and the focus goes back to it. All week leading to this fight, and even prior to that, you start seeing these interviews that Conor McGregor's doing. You start seeing the press. You see Dustin Poirier, very composed, not as emotional as in the past. Conor McGregor, very calm, not very apologetic about his past, but very reasonable in his approach as to the events that he had been involved in, and scenarios and situations that he had been involved in that had caused bad publicity for the UFC, for him. He had been displayed in a bad light. Very open when he's talking through these interviews, very willing to engage the conversation, not running away, not shying away, not cracking jokes, not demeaning his opponent, not talking over people, not being that typical brash, loudmouth self that he is, and why he became Mystic Mac and Conor McGregor, why he gained so much popularity, because he was just running his mouth and fighting with the best of them and doing whatever the hell he wanted. He was a different Conor McGregor, and you almost got the feeling as if, is this his strategy, that he's trying to now mess around mentally with Dustin Poirier, that this is a different fighter and then the animal comes out in the octagon? Or is this really him now? It was hard to discern between the two and what version of Conor we were seeing. Nonetheless, this was him. He stayed true to this version of McGregor that we were seeing. And this led us up to the press conference. The weigh-ins happened on Friday, and he still comes out. There's a big buzz, big energy in the building. Yas Island was at a high point. Everybody's excited to see this. This is a rematch that should have happened before, but it couldn't have been too late. Now these two fighters are at new points, new peaks in their careers. And from where they were when they first faced each other, and Conor McGregor does the weigh-in, flexes, they face off, and then he half hugs Dustin Poirier, still playing the respectful card, shaking his hand, hugging him, embracing the moment, being very kind, very generous, very soft-spoken throughout the whole thing. Dustin Poirier pulls out some of his personal brand hot sauce that he has, hands it to Conor McGregor. This is all happening at the weigh-in. Neither one's really engaging in the trash talking. And we're like, what McGregor is this? What version is this, right? Is this going to backfire on Dustin tomorrow? And a lot of people started saying that. Dustin he just fed into it. He just bought into it. He thinks that this is a nice guy, and this may very well play a role mentally on Dustin Poirier come fight time. Well, we reached the fight. Michael Chandler dispatches of Dan Hooker, and we get some waves caused with that win in the lightweight division, and out comes McGregor, out comes Dustin Poirier, the introductions, and we go at it. The bell rings, and you see Conor McGregor looking good, almost looking like the bigger of the two fighters, in great shape. Dustin Poirier, as usual, business as usual, in good shape. Comes out very composed. Both fighters come out. Conor McGregor looking quick, immediately starts landing some punches, immediately starts pushing forward, pushing the action. You see Dustin Poirier having a little bit of a tough time settling into his game, but of course he's a very, very smart fighter. And definitely more so in the last few years, where he knows, even if people think that he's losing, he's just adapting, and he's constantly adapting to the moment. And it's something that Dustin has been doing the last few fights. And even when people think he's in danger, he's about to go out, he's just a punch away from shifting momentum to his favor. The buzz in the air was behind Conor McGregor and the performance that he would do stepping into the octagon. This had him basically to the date, or within 2 days of a year, being removed a year from the last time that he stepped into the octagon, and that was to kick off 2020 in that awesome quick fashion performance that he had against Cowboy Cerrone, where he stops him with heavy hands and shoulder strikes. So we see him here. He starts moving quick. He starts landing punches. Like always, McGregor in quick fashion, quick start, and tries to get his opponents shaken early. Dustin Poirier stays composed. He catches his breath. He continues to push forward. He's landing his own punches and pushing the action back. And it was, you just felt it. A lot of nervous energy around this fight. A lot of nervous energy on behalf of both fighters. And that ends up basically settling that first round with some minor key points that I haven't mentioned. Dustin ends up landing a kick, and the kick to the calf ends up messing up McGregor. Although it didn't show, it showed in his movement. And that round ends, and you feel like McGregor's going to come out strong again. Poirier ends up going to the legs. He starts attacking that lead leg, which ends up messing up McGregor's foundation, and eventually ends up being the reason why he just finishes him. McGregor loses his base, could no longer sit on his punches, is no longer standing properly. You see him retrieving, Dustin Poirier pushing forward, and stops McGregor in the second round. A bloody McGregor gets cut up, slides down the cage. As his back slides down, the side of his back sliding down the cage as Dustin Poirier lands some heavy leather on him, and the fight is waved off. He could not stand up, his leg is messed up, and his face was messed up. He landed some good punches on Dustin Poirier. That would have been the game plan that Conor wanted to prove that he had superior stand-up to Dustin Poirier, but it backfired because he got so focused in that stand-up game that it backfired on him. And Dustin Poirier, the professional that he is, he mixed his striking. He mixed his game plan, which is mixed martial arts. He used every one of his weapons available, and he looked great doing it. He looked impressive, and hands down, he is the best lightweight in the UFC at the moment. With Justin dropping to 2, I believe the standings now have Charles Oliveira at 3 and Michael Chandler at 4 because of that recent win. McGregor ends up sliding to 6, I believe, with Rafael dos Anjos shoulder to shoulder with them now at 7. So we'll see how this all plays out. Does Dustin Poirier, first of all, is Khabib gone? Is Khabib gone now? Is Khabib retired? We don't know. We don't know if he's coming back. Are they going to generate another interim title? And we're going to see Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje in a rematch. They had an amazing fight in Phoenix a few years back. Are we going to see them in a rematch this time going for the interim title? Or are they actually going to fight for the main title? Are they even going to fight at all? Is Justin Gaethje going to fight Michael Chandler? Is Charles Oliveira the one that deserves a title shot against Dustin Poirier? One thing's for sure is that whole lightweight division is a mess, and it's still stacked. It's still interesting to watch. You got Dan Hooker in there. You got Tony Ferguson, who's coming off of back-to-back losses, and it's almost like they're starting to discard Tony Ferguson as well. He seems to be on the downside of his career right now, but he's game, right? I mean, you could see Tony Ferguson against Dan Hooker. You could see Tony Ferguson against anybody. He's coming off that loss to Justin Gaethje and coming off the loss to Charles Oliveira. But he'd be willing to fight anybody, maybe him against Conor McGregor. And with an impressive win on either side, they get back in the conversation. With an impressive win against Tony Ferguson, anybody with an impressive win against Tony Ferguson, you're probably going to start seeing the end of Tony Ferguson in the UFC. Now, I mentioned Rafael dos Anjos and Conor McGregor. They're shoulder to shoulder in the standings. I believe they're 6 and 7 respectively. They should have fought years ago when Rafael dos Anjos was the champ, and he ends up injuring his foot, falls out of the fight, and that Conor McGregor dos Anjos title fight never happened. Now they happen to be shoulder to shoulder in the standings again. Why not? But now we have a deficiency in Conor McGregor's side, which is the leg strikes. He is susceptible to the leg strikes, and Dustin Poirier exposed another hole in McGregor's armor, and that is something that Rafael dos Anjos is a perfectionist at. He's almost one of the originals in the UFC to start going for those ankle kicks and calf kicks. This is maybe 4 or 5 years back now. So that's going to be interesting to see how this whole thing plays out. But first, we got to figure out if Khabib is gone or not. With that said, this card ended up being the third card in a matter of 8 days that the UFC put together. And that's how they kicked off 2021 in the month of January. It was very nice of them to give us a breather come January 30th. January 30th, they give us a breather, no UFC events. And the following week, we bounce over to February and to kick off the month of February, which is just a couple weeks ago. As I sit here and record this, we have Alistair Overeem Super Bowl weekend going against Alexander Volkov. Alexander Volkov with the 32 and 8 record going into the fight, 33-8 now. That tells you that he ended up defeating and knocking out Alistair Overeem. He ends up dispatching Alistair Overeem in the second round. The key to this fight was Alistair Overeem's title run. He's been announcing that he's giving it all he's got for one final run at that title. He wants to conquer that UFC title. He's in the latter stages of his career. He's been in the latter stages of his career, and somehow he finds these bursts of energy and resurges his career, gets some good wins, and then loses, and then gets some other good wins, and then loses. And so he's been like that because the competition is that good in that heavyweight division. This fight with the win, without a doubt, with the legendary career that Alistair Overeem has managed to put together, the impressive resume that is Alistair Overeem, this win, if he would have defeated Volkov, he, without a doubt, would have been in a title shot facing the winner of the upcoming Stipe Ngannou fight. Now, who knows? Volkov did away with them, knocks him out fairly ugly, put some damage to Alistair Overeem. Alexander Volkov is going to have maybe 1, maybe 2 fights before he gets into title contention, and we may very well see it by the end of by the time that this year is coming to a close. We may see Volkov in there if he dispatches of a future opponent or opponents in the same fashion in which he did to Alistair Overeem. He's that good, and he's getting there. The heavyweight division is not the same that it was in years past. Alexander Volkov has every shot to get into title contention right now, as it is not the same division. The other big name in the heavyweight division that has not made his debut yet in that division is none other than Johnny Bones Jones. He's going to be fighting at heavyweight, and now with Overeem losing, the general consensus is that Jones is going to get his first shot at a heavyweight title once the Stipe Ngannou situation gets figured out. Jones will have first crack at that, at either the current champ or the new champ. What else did we see on that card? February 6th, the co-main event. We had Michael Johnson, who loses a decision fight to Clay Guida. That was an action-packed fight. But the co-main event was Corey Sandhagen against Frankie Edgar. And again, Frankie Edgar on a similar path to a bantamweight title this time, similar path as that to Alistair Overeem, giving it one last shot for the title, leaving it all out. They win some, they lose some, they win some, and it's the resume, the career, what Frankie Edgar has meant to the UFC, similar to what Alistair Overeem has meant to the entire sport of mixed martial arts. Frankie Edgar against the up-and-coming rising star, Corey Sandhagen. Corey Sandhagen, it only takes him 28 seconds to get rid of Frankie Edgar as he puts a knee to the cranium of Frankie Edgar and drops him face first onto the mat. And that was all she wrote. Corey Sandhagen gets a knockout victory in 28 seconds against Frankie Edgar. Alistair Overeem loses. We don't know if these two fighters are going to be hanging it up, or if they're both going to return, or if one will hang it up, or vice versa. We'll monitor that, and we'll see what happens in the coming weeks as far as them. But that was another impressive way to start the month of February. We go back to the following week. UFC 258 in the long-awaited matchup between Kamaru Usman and Gilbert Burns, the once partners, end up facing against one another, and the story was there, a little bit of hatred on both of their parts as far as the lead-in is concerned, right? I got the best of you in training, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Kamaru Usman was saying, this guy's trying to take food from my family's plate. You name it. The story was there. The buildup was there. These guys were just heated. It was very tense. The weigh-in was tense. The face-offs were tense. Even in the octagon before the bell rings, those stare-downs were just tense from one another. And the fight did not disappoint. Kamaru Usman ends up doing away, stopping Gilbert Burns in round 3. Gilbert Burns, beyond impressed with his talent. He comes out, he puts on a good, good first onslaught attack against Kamaru Usman, lands some heavy right hands, overhand rights to Kamaru Usman, knocks his balance off, and nearly stops Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman managed to compose himself, gather himself, and start attacking forward. Round 1 ended. By round 2, Kamaru Usman's jab was the talk of the night. Kamaru Usman starts landing that consistent jab, and he ends up hitting it. I mean, that jab could do anything but land. If I'm saying that correctly, that jab could do no wrong. It was land every time he threw a jab, it was landing, and it was hitting Burns on the nose, on the mouth, on the teeth, on the chin, on the forehead. It was money. Kamaru Usman had a beautiful jab, and it kept stopping Gilbert Burns in his tracks. It just kept delaying him. Gilbert Burns would push forward, that jab would push him back, and that jab started hurting him to the point where it softened up Gilbert Burns so much that at several points, as Kamaru would just throw it, didn't even look like it was a hard jab, but it was a stiff jab. He would stop Gilbert Burns in his tracks and would drop him. Gilbert Burns would go backwards and go onto the ground. Kamaru Usman with a masterful performance, and he is en route to possibly becoming the greatest welterweight of all time. Yes, I'm saying it. His impressive run that he has right now, that 18-1 record that he has now, and the defenses, I believe this was his 6th defense, which surpasses George St. Pierre. So yes, George St. Pierre has been up there. Kamaru Usman is making a strong argument for possibly becoming the greatest welterweight in UFC history. He has a strong argument for that. And I mean, wow. Who do we see him against next? Masvidal 2? Do we see him against Colby 2? Do we see him against Leon Edwards, or the winner of Leon Edwards and the new match that I'll tell you about right now? I mean, wow, what a performance, right? On the undercard, you saw the co-main event. Alexa Grasso ends up defeating Macy Barber. Kelvin Gastelum back on the winning column by defeating Ian Heinisch. And then there was another impressive fight that took place, and that was on the prelims. The welterweight division had Belal Muhammad against Diego Lima. That was an awesome fight. It went all the way. Belal gets the decision, and he ends up winning huge, not just this fight. What I was going to mention right now when we're talking about Kamaru, who his next opponent will be, well, we saw Michael Chiesa move up against Neil Magny to replace the fight that fell through again between Leon Edwards and Khamzat Chimaev. The fight ends up falling through again. Khamzat Chimaev is still having issues. So we're going to see Leon Edwards back in action, and the fight was already rescheduled between Edwards and Khamzat Chimaev to take place in March. And I believe it was going to be March 13th. I'm going to confirm for you. I'm checking it right now. Yep. Saturday, March 13th is when Leon Edwards and Khamzat were supposed to go back at it, and the fight falls through, except Leon Edwards stays on the main event. Dana White's going to give him a fight after he suffered so much, going in and out of fights, not being able to get out of the country because of the pandemic and blah, blah, blah. Couldn't get the fight with Kamaru, couldn't get the fight done with Khamzat, couldn't get into, you name it, right? Like it one after the other just kept happening to Leon Edwards. Horrible 2020 that he had. And it looked like this year was going to change for him, and it started going that route again. And now they're going to do right by him. Belal Muhammad has moved into that spot, to that main event spot against Leon Edwards, and he's going to step in for Khamzat Chimaev. That win against Diego Lima was that good, and he accepted the challenge, and now he got himself into a main event fight, and against none other than Leon Edwards. Both amazing fighters. We're either going to see Leon Edwards win and skyrocket into a title shot, or we're going to see Belal Muhammad win and get into title contention and into the bigger names in the top echelon of that welterweight division. So that was your UFC 258 recap. Big stacked card to lead the weekend for Valentine's Day, and we catch up with the most recent event that took place. And the most recent event was between none other than Derek Lewis against Curtis Blades. A fight that should have happened before, again, affected by the virus, ends up falling through late last year. The fight finally happened. A little bit of smack talk on both of these guys' behalf. Curtis Blades looked good. Curtis Blades looked really good. His attacks, the way that he mixes his attacks, his onslaught, he pushes forward, he puts good combinations forward, and he was landing on Derek Lewis. He was connecting on Derek Lewis, doing good. His game plan was working, and Derek Lewis ends up catching on one of the Curtis Blades' attacks. He swings up with his right hand, drops his head. Derek Lewis meets him down the center and greets him with a strong right hand uppercut to the chin and of Curtis Blades, and puts his lights out, with Curtis Blades landing face first onto the mat. Derek Lewis knocks him out, gets back in that wing column in impressive fashion. That was an awesome showing by both fighters. And you knew that these guys, it was going to go one or the other. Curtis Blades was looking really good, and it looks like he was either going to cruise to a decision or possibly stop Derek Lewis. Derek Lewis just was not taking no for an answer. He just seems so calm. You never really see Derek Lewis worried. He has the same stone expression on his face, and he ends up stopping Curtis Blades. That was a hell of a headlining event between these two. Supporting card, you saw Alexei Oleinik take a loss. He got knocked out by Chris Dawkins. You saw Phil Haas in action in the middleweight division against Nasruddin Imamov. Andrei Arlovsky gets submitted in that card. He loses, another legend of the sport, and he lost once again. The co-main event was a women's bantamweight match between Ketlin Vieira, in which she loses a decision to Yana Kunitskaya. She goes 14-5 now, improves her record. A lot of good fights, a lot of contenders in the making here. And these are the cards that are interesting, because these are the cards that a lot of people don't pay attention to. A lot of the fighters that don't have the name recognition yet, and yet they're doing work. And next thing you know, they're in title contention, and people are like, who is this fighter? Who is this young girl or this guy getting into title contention against this guy? Like, where did he come from? This is where they're at. They're always on these prelim cards. They're always on the undercards. People are not paying attention to them. And look at Belal Muhammad, ever so proving that point, right? Gets on the prelim card, gets an impressive win against Diego Lima, and ends up moving himself into a main event against none other than Leon Edwards. So, to revisit what took place January 20th, Michael Chiesa beating Neil Magny, calling out Colby Covington. Colby Covington passes up on the fight versus Leon Edwards. Now, that fight would make sense. He got called out. That fight would make sense. Now that Masvidal, after this win, it looks like Jorge Masvidal may be going into the TUF series as one of the coaches, and Kamaru Usman may very well be leading into the second, as the second coach of the TUF series. And we might, if this does come to fruition, we're most likely going to see Masvidal Usman 2. This time, Masvidal having a full training camp. Something that Usman considers that the Masvidal's using as an excuse, but hey, it is what it is. Masvidal took the challenge on 6 days' notice and stepped in and still gave a good fight to Kamaru Usman. So with a full camp, who knows? Sky's the limit to see what that fight with Jorge Masvidal would bring with the full camp. In a full camp setting for it to be able to prepare for Kamaru Usman rather than jumping in on 6 days notice. And of course, these guys are always in shape. They're always training, so forth. But the weight cut on a 6 days notice, what he did was very impressive. And Kamaru Usman is discarding that as excuses, as invalid of an argument on behalf of Masvidal and his fans. But the truth is that he had to cut a lot of weight in 6 days. cut the weight like a true professional, stepped in the octagon, and gave a hell of a fight to Kamaru Usman on 6 days' notice. So the ever so professional that Jorge Masvidal is, and as impressive as he always is, performance in, performance out. I can't wait. If that does get signed and they both become the coaches, that's bound to be an awesome season of Tough, of The Ultimate Fighter. And then, of course, culminating with the two coaches facing one another in the octagon. So with that, we are caught up, and we're still not done with the month of February. What a way to kick off 2021 on behalf of the UFC. We have many more events coming. One fight that we have coming up, I believe, is going to be next week with Rosenstrike versus Cyril Gane. I'll confirm that. Yes, so Saturday we got Jairzinho Rosenstrike versus Cyril Gane. That's gonna be a good fight. In that same undercard, you're gonna have Pedro Munoz in that bantamweight division facing Jimmy Rivera, Angela Hill, Ashley Yoder, Alex Caceres is gonna be on that card as well. And that's going to be your lead towards UFC 259, which will kick off the month of March. And that is that stacked card with Israel Adesanya making his debut in the light heavyweight division against Jan Blachowicz, who's going to put his title on the line. And then the second title fight of that night is going to be Amanda Nunes against Megan Anderson, defending her featherweight title. And the third title fight in that card is going to be Peter Yan versus Aljamain Sterling, defending that bantamweight title. So that card's going to be stacked. The UFC's not slowing down. They're not hitting the brakes anytime soon. And with that said, this hands down is the longest episode that I've done on the Toma Todito show. Hands down. You could fact check me if you like, but I have no doubts. I've never talked this much. I'm always this excited talking about the fight game, but this one, hands down, is a full recap of what we've seen the UFC put together so far. Other side news, I guess, in MMA, Bellator is going to be kicking off, come April, I believe, early April. The PFL is going to be kicking off late April. They're joining the game very late, and they're letting the UFC just take it all right now. UFC is doing work on both of those organizations. The PFL season kicks off late April. Bellator is going to kick off their first event, I believe, is with Patricio Bulldog, I think, or Pitbull. Pitbull's gonna be kicking off that first event. I think is Bellator 255, if I'm correct. And then something else that you missed, that Super Bowl weekend on that Friday night, you had Paige Van Zandt make her debut in BKFC, in which she was stopped. She lost her debut event. Something that she signed a contract that was brand new for her. That type of fight, you could see that she was uncomfortable after the first round. She wanted to incorporate some kicks. She wanted to incorporate a takedown. And if that would have been the case, she very well could have won that fight, right? Because the other girl is a stand-up fighter. Nonetheless, she ended up losing her debut with the BKFC. I believe her name was Brittany Hart. Britain Hart, sorry. So she's just a stand-up fighter. She's a scrappy fighter. Britain Hart is with the 2-2 record in the BKFC, and she took it to Paige Van Zandt. Paige Van Zandt was no victim either. She did some damage to Britain Hart, but she lost that decision, and she loses her debut in that big contract signing that the BKFC put together for Paige Van Zandt, the big debut. This was her first pay-per-view that they put together on that Friday before Overeem's card against Volkov, Saturday the 6th. BKFC did their thing, their first pay-per-view. They did everything. I think they even had Shaq present at that event. Something else that we saw that day was during that card, Chris Lieben, former UFC star, former fighter, former tough contender. Chris Lieben retired. He stopped his opponent, and he's gone. He ended up facing a gentleman by the last name of Henry. He ends up stopping him. These are just knockout, drag out type fights, bloody matches. But it's, if I don't tell you that it's fun to watch, I'd be lying to you. It was entertaining. It was definitely entertaining. Some of these fights were pretty fun. The Paige Van Zandt fight, I was definitely interested to see how she would manage just standing up and not incorporating any of her other attacks. And it was obvious that she's not accustomed to this style of fighting. She's accustomed to mixing it up, and she looked uncomfortable after the first round, and heading into the second, knowing that, okay, now I got to do this all over again. The other girl, that's all she's been training. She's just a scrappy brawler, and she put those knuckles on Paige's face, and they both ended up pretty marked up. Bretton Hart, I believe, was the one bleeding out of the two, but there's no reason why you would think that Paige Van Zandt's not going to improve. This is the contract that she signed. Now she knows what she has to focus. Now she knows what to expect, and you're bound to see a brand new version of Paige Van Zandt come her second fight in the BKFC. Great win by Bretton Hart there, and awesome for BKFC because they got a lot of notoriety. Their prelims were actually airing free on YouTube that night, and then they put together their first pay-per-view. So good for them as the organization is growing, and they're attracting a lot of attention with names like Paige Van Zandt and Chris Levin and other names there. So they're attracting a lot of eyeballs now. Last night, good win. Curtis Blades loses by knockout. Good win for Derek Lewis, and we move on. We move on to more UFC and what they have holding for us this first quarter of 2021. So with that, I leave you. I just broke the hour from what I'm seeing here. I just broke the hour as far as this episode is concerned. Hands down, the longest episode that I've put together, but we are all caught up with the UFC and MMA in its entirety as far as stateside is concerned, as far as these big organizations are concerned. We're all caught up with 2021, and we push forward, and we shouldn't have any more delays hitting the Tomatolito show. So you shouldn't be experiencing these big gaps as far as episodes are concerned. We'll jump into boxing in the upcoming episodes, as there's been some awesome fights as well, and we'll continue to put out some more content. So thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully this long episode accompanied you during your run, or accompanied you on your drive to work or from work, heading home, or if you're just working out or just hanging out at home. Hopefully I was able to keep you company and catch you up in case you've been as busy as I have these last couple months. Hopefully this caught you up with MMA and the UFC overall. So, and of course, Super Bowl Sunday, who won? Well, Tampa, Tom Brady, the GOAT. He ended up dismantling the Kansas City Chiefs, and mostly his defense. His offense was awesome. The defense ended up putting the works on the Chiefs, and I saw a meme where they had Tom Brady carrying Patrick Mahomes on his shoulders, and it said take your son to work day. So that was pretty catchy, pretty hilarious to me. Nonetheless, hey, we move forward on to bigger and better fights, and stay tuned. This week I'll have several episodes going up in air and headed your way. Take care of yourselves. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you all soon.